Hello, friends. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Michelle Fondin. I'm the author of the brand new book, The 8 Limbs of Yoga for Modern Times, a practical guide to the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. You can pick up any of my 12 published books on Amazon. If you're new to my channel, welcome. Thank you for subscribing below. Click on the bell, scroll up to all for all notifications. Thank you for giving the video a thumbs up. Don't forget to join me and register below for an immersion into meditation info session. That is the meditation course I teach on June 5th, 2025 at 5 p.m. Pacific time, but you must register to attend the Zoom seminar. I will be giving away some free books. But every yogi, whether you're a yoga practitioner or a yoga teacher or running a yoga teacher training program, every yogi needs to be meditating. So do register for that below if you don't yet have your personalized mantra. Today, we are talking about the fourth yama, which is Brahmacharya. That is a big, heaping mouthful of word. It is the fourth yama. The yamas, of course, are ethical and moral codes. Yamas are the first limb of yoga, but this is the fourth principle of the first limb of yoga called Brahmacharya. So we're gonna break this down, and actually, this is only part 1 of a part 2 series on Brahmacharya. And the reason for that is that Brahmacharya is a big deal. You might not think it's a big deal. It's actually quite a big deal. In the way that I interpret Brahmacharya, this is a little hairy, right? Brahmacharya means sexual restraint. Literally, it means to retain the semen retention, if you will, in the men who were practicing yoga at the time that the Yoga Sutras were formulated. Let's talk a little bit about Brahmacharya. I'm going to read to you the Yoga Sutra pertaining to Brahmacharya, and then I'm gonna dive deep into what my meaning of Brahmacharya is for you. The Yoga Sutra says, one who is established in continence or sexual restraint gains vitality, and that is Yoga Sutra chapter 2, verse 38. So, as I mentioned, the fourth yama can be a bit confusing to the modern yogi. Why? Because this notion of sexual restraint was really designed for the men living in the forest academies and learning and living under a guru. During those times, celibacy was not only quite common, but it was required of those living in these forest academies, which in modern day are called āśramas. The men, and sometimes women later on, but for all intents and purposes, you and I both know that 4,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, it was the men that were in these types of communities where they were learning under the guidance of a guru, a spiritual teacher. They were all men. And in the forest academies, they got these men that they were not men, they were boys. They were boys as young as 11 or 12 years old. And they stayed in these forest academies for 12 years. Now, think about it. Just think about it. You get a whole bunch, hundreds of 11 and 12-year-old boys just at the cusp of puberty, learning about their bodies, seeing their bodies go through changes. Whether it was 4,000 years ago or today, everyone goes through the same kinds of thing when they're going through puberty. Well, living in this very disciplined type of society, the subsect of a society, which was not religious, but it was spiritual, they had to have certain rules, and those boys had to follow those rules. Now, if you've ever taught teenage boys, if you've ever been in a group with teenage boys, you know that there's a lot of mischief that goes on. And they were probably just trying to get the boys to be really disciplined and not touching themselves or touching other people or doing the things that they weren't supposed to be doing or getting distracted. And so the requirement for sexual restraint, the requirement for celibacy was really designed for the men in these forest academies or later on in āśramas or living the monastic life, was that vow of celibacy. You need to have sexual restraint. Now, the Hatha Yoga Pradipika does talk about semen retention as a way, and that's of course for men, as a way, if you will, as a way to gain that vital energy. So when we talk about prana, the life force energy, when you expend your sexual energy, you are letting it go. And so it was a way that they could accumulate that creative force energy to then channel it through into spiritual enlightenment. Now, the problem with this, here is the problem with the old interpretation of Brahmacharya and even the more recent interpretation of Brahmacharya by the yogis who wrote different books in the 20th century. I'm not even talking about way far back. I'm talking about yogis who have written about Brahmacharya in the 20th century, in the 21st century, mostly in the 20th century though, was they really interpreted it at face value. So they talked about sexual restraint. They talked about perhaps the sexual act not needing to be done except for procreation. And that really brings us more to religious dogma. And that wasn't the pure intent of Brahmacharya to start with at all. It was really to get the yogi focused, to get them not distracted, and to channel their sexual and creative energy into something higher. To not suppress it, because to suppress something is to make it be distorted. And that's where we get into problems when we suppress our sexual and creative force. It was never intended to be like that. The misinterpretation of Brahmacharya is that it sounds more like suppression than discipline. Now, when I talk about discipline and talk about sexual restraint or creative control restraint, and honestly, that's really what I'm going to talk about in this second video on Brahmacharya is the fact of creative control, because that takes us to the real root of the word Brahmacharya, which I'm not even going to mention in this video. Little teaser for the second video, because I feel like there's enough to address here about the interpretation of Brahmacharya to go on for a little bit, and I don't want to add on to the video. That's why I'm doing a second video. So when we talk about sexual restraint or sexual control or creative control, what I interpret it to be for modern yogis is the word discernment. Having the proper discernment with your sexual energy. So it's not shame. It's not something to repress or suppress. It's just having proper discernment with how you're going to use this creative force, this sexual energy creative force. Now, most of us in modern society don't even have the wherewithal to have proper discernment because we're taught to have a lot of shame surrounding our sexual energy. And our sexual energy is one of the most potent and powerful energies that there is. Seriously, it's potent, it's powerful. It was never meant to be shameful. It really wasn't. That wasn't the whole point and purpose to this because, okay, here's what I mentioned in the book. The reason why I know this to be certain is that we have desires, right? We have the desire to eat, to keep our body healthy and strong and to live. We have the desire to drink water, notably, because we are like 3/4 water. Our bodies are 3/4 water. We have the desire to sleep because our body needs rest and it's just a natural thing that we must have. We have the desire to seek shelter from the natural elements and to protect ourselves. But really, one of the most potent and powerful drives, desires we have is the sexual desire. Because of course, in order to procreate, we need to have that sexual desire. Now, here's why I say it was never meant to be suppressed, and it was never meant to be shameful. Here's why. We are not like other animals. If you look at the animal kingdom, most animals only mate during mating season. So they only have the desire for the sexual impulse during mating season. And so they have the sexual impulse to mate during mating season. And when mating season is over, they go about their daily lives and there's no sexual impulse. Humans are very different. We don't have a mating season. We don't have desires for the sexual impulse just to mate. And so therefore, by way of our natural biological desires, it is to be deducted that we are not to suppress it and we're not to be ashamed of it because it's just part and parcel of who we are as human beings. But discernment of how to use that sexual impulse, that sexual desire, is why we have higher level thinking. In the same way, and I know this is super problematic for many humans in today's day and age, is we have the desire to eat, right? To sustain our bodies. However, without proper discernment, higher level thinking, we have a tendency to overeat or eat at the inappropriate times when we're not really hungry, but we're bored, we're scared, we're sad, we're depressed, or we just can't sleep, and so we eat. And so without the discernment factor, a lot of things can happen where the eating gets out of control. Well, in the same way, our impulse to have the sexual desire play out, without proper discernment, higher level thinking, it can get out of control. And so this is not about suppression. It's not about repression. It's not about shame. Like in the way that the older yogis have interpreted Brahmacharya, it's really about the discernment of how you decide, mindfully decide, consciously decide how to use that sexual energy. So that's Brahmacharya, is how am I going to be discerning in the use of this sexual energy so that it does not run amok? In the same way as I mentioned it compared to eating, which I don't even know how that came up for me just now, but it just did. But in the same way is like, if you are a yogi with proper discipline and respect for your body, you're not going to let that desire to eat food run amok. You're going to have some discernment. You're going to have some restraint or control, self-control, right? It's not that somebody else is controlling you. It's that you are having enough restraint and discernment to understand, okay, I'm eating when my body is actually needing food to fuel it, when it's hungry. In the same way, when we have the sexual impulse, it's like we need to decide when it's appropriate to let that play out. Now, that's not to say that you can't have fun, because part of having that desire is to also have fun, is to also let it play out. But it does mean that you're a lot more mindful of it when you don't feel it's being restricted. Because a lot of religions that we grew up in taught us that sex was shameful, sex was bad, it's to be reserved only for marriage and only with one partner for the whole life. And then we have these distorted notions of what the sexual impulse means. So everything becomes distorted when it is suppressed or repressed. And then it plays out in really unhealthful ways because we can't discern how to let it play out in a more decisive manner. And so that's when things get really hairy And so when we look at Brahmacharya is, I'm going to be mindful about my sexual impulse. I'm going to be mindful of how I decide to use it. Then we can have a very healthful and healthy relationship with our sexual impulse, so that it doesn't become where we have to think like the ancient yogis and say, I need to be celibate, or I need to only have sex to procreate. And that was never the intention of Brahmacharya, which I'll explain a lot more in the second video on this topic. So I hope this was helpful for you to understand what Brahmacharya means if you are studying the 8 limbs of yoga and the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. I want to thank you so much for joining me here today. Thank you for subscribing below. Click on the bell, scroll up to all for all notifications. And thank you for giving the video a thumbs up. Thank you for sharing this video with others who are studying yoga, yoga teachers, yoga teacher training programs. Thank you so much for your support of my YouTube channel. You can buy one of my 12 published books. You can join my meditation course, which is a wonderful course that will get you meditating on your own with your personal mantra, and this will be a lifelong practice. Thank you so much, and I'll see you in the next video.